Okay, then for premise 4, all we want to do is specify whether or not the data matches the prediction or not. And in this case, it does. We predicted that the death rate would fall if the doctors washed their hands. That's what Semmelweis predicted. And then he went out and tried it, and he found that the death rate did in fact drop from 10% to 2%. So that's all we need for premise 4. Now in premise 5, recall that what we want to do here is consider whether or not there are any other reasonable explanations for the data. So Semmelweis' hypothesis can explain the data. Semmelweis' hypothesis can explain why the death rate dropped, but are there any other competing explanations for why the death rate dropped? If there are, then even though the data and prediction match, we should be hesitant to accept Semmelweis' hypothesis because we have this other good explanation. Okay, so is there any other explanation? Well, sure, of course, there's always going to be other explanations, and one even kind of okay explanation is that it wasn't the cadaveric matter. So let's go back to here. It wasn't the cadaveric matter that the doctors were getting their hands dirty with right before they examined the women that was causing the childbed fever, but rather it was something else that the doctors had on their hands just from their day-to-day lives. And so cleaning the hands caused whatever that was to be washed off. So let's just jot that down as another possible explanation for the data. Okay, so this is another possible explanation. It's not the only other possible explanation, but let's say, maybe you can think of something better, but let's say that this is the best alternative to Semmelweis' hypothesis. Okay, so one question we want to ask is there anything wrong with this explanation? Is there any reason why we wouldn't want to accept it, or why we wouldn't want to say that it is a good competitor to Semmelweis' hypothesis? And one thing we might say is that this explanation isn't quite as good because we noticed that, well, one, these doctors were going from doing the autopsies directly to examining the women, so just is reasonable to suppose that they did have cadaveric matter on their hands. And two, we know that the women who were working as midwives in the second division, so that's up here, plus we know that the midwives who were working in the second division, not doctors, but just women who were taking care of the women and delivering babies, they didn't need to wash their hands. They didn't perform autopsies, and they didn't need to wash their hands in order to achieve their low death rate. So it seems as though whatever the chlorinated lime was doing when the doctors washed their hands with it, it wasn't merely washing off something that just came from living in 19th century Vienna. It wasn't something that the midwives had on their hands. Most likely it was washing something off that came from the cadavers. So we'll just include that here in premise 5. Okay, so what we've done here is consider another explanation, another somewhat reasonable explanation, but then we've ruled it out. So as it stands, Semmelweis' hypothesis is the best explanation for the data, and so consequently we can draw the conclusion. Therefore, the hypothesis, that is the hypothesis in premise 1, is probably correct. No guarantee, but probably it is correct. Oops. Okay, so that's how we finish this particular argument up. Now, just notice that in premise 5, it's, we've done a good bit more there, and we haven't been able to rely on exactly what it says in the passage. So when you're doing this, you often want to take a little bit of care, think about what you're going to put down for premise 5, and then make sure that you write it out clearly. It's going to be probably multiple sentences long. So try to put together something good that will show that you've considered other possible explanations for the data. And in this case, we were able to rule out this other possible explanation. You won't always be able to do that, but whatever you are able to do in premise 5 is important, and it's going to indicate how or what the conclusion to the argument is going to be. In this case, since we were able to rule out that other possible explanation, we can draw the conclusion that the hypothesis is probably correct.